Hello everyone, and welcome to the Ontario Invasive Species Forum, hosted by the Invasive Species Centre. My name is Madison McKegg, and I am an aquatic specialist at the Invasive Species Centre, and I will be your moderator for today's session. So this session is called Invading Ontario Waters Part 2, Research, Knowledge, and Outreach on Aquatic Invasive Species. Hopefully you were able to tune into Part 1 about Asian carps that just wrapped up. It was a really great session. So for this session, we have 4 speakers lined up to give presentations. But before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. First, we'll have time for a couple minutes of questions at the end of each speaker's talk. So just type them into the question box as we go, and I will read them to the speaker after they present. Second, if you're having any technical difficulties, we can try and resolve those for you. If you type them into the question box as well, we'll do our best for that. So kicking things off today, we have Tim Gingera. So Tim has been a biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada for 3 years. He first joined with the Asian Carp program in 2017, and then moved to Winnipeg, Manitoba to join the AIS program in the Ontario and Prairies region. Tim is now the acting National AIS Advisor in the National Capital Region and the Secretariat for the National Aquatic Invasive Species Committee. In 2019, this committee identified the need to standardize Don't Let It Loose materials across Canada. They have developed a nationally recognizable message that aligns with federal, provincial, and territorial AIS, fisheries, and other regulations. This presentation will discuss the committee's vision for Don't Let It Loose and what is being done to grow AIS awareness through this initiative. So Tim, just give me 1 second here to share controls with you, and then I'll let you take it away. And you should have controls there now, Tim.
Yes, I see it. 1 moment.
Perfect.
You can see it?
Yep, looks great.
Fantastic. Just turn my webcam on here. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Tim Gingera, and I'm a biologist with the Federal Government of Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I just want to start off by thanking Maddie and to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present on our efforts to standardize Don't Let It Loose public education and outreach messaging across Canada. This work was done in collaboration with provincial and territorial governments through the National Aquatic Invasive Species Committee, or NAISC for short. So here is an overview of what I'll be discussing today. I'm going to start off with a quick background on the origins of Don't Let It Loose, followed by an analysis of the gaps that we identified within the existing messaging, and then what was needed to be addressed in order for it to be implemented consistently across Canada. Then I'll walk you through the materials we developed and the reasoning behind them, and I'll provide some information about our brand toolkit, which is essentially our guiding document for implementation. And then finally, I'll outline some of our next steps. So a bit of background. Don't Let It Loose was actually first developed as an education and outreach tagline in the Florida Everglades back in 2009 to prevent the release of both terrestrial and aquatic pets that could become invasive in the wild. So in the US, Don't Let It Loose is endorsed by federal and state governments and or invasive species councils in several different states. And you can see the logo that they use here. However, historically in Canada, Don't Let It Loose has only been used in British Columbia and Alberta. British Columbia used a similar logo as in the US, which is here on the left, while Alberta had developed their own logo, which you can see here on the right. Essentially, this inconsistent application in Canada essentially dilutes the effectiveness of the message to the public. So here are some of the gaps that we found with the existing logos and what was being used. Pre-existing Don't Let It Loose logos were focused solely on pets, with an emphasis on terrestrial species. This means that aquatic invasive species that are released along other pathways than the aquarium trades, such as from water gardens or from bait, were not being targeted. So that's a clear gap. In addition, pre-existing logos did not contain a visual representation of the act of releasing the organism, such as dumping a bucket or flushing a toilet or opening a cage, which you can see here. It's really just the animals on the logo. Let me go back here. So this could have led to confusing the public into thinking that they were not allowed. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're just not seeing your slides advancing here. I'm only seeing the first slide.
Oh, that's not good. Give me one moment, please. I'm just going to stop sharing and then I'll pull it back up.
Sounds great.
Do you see the presentation again?
I see the first slide, yeah.
Okay.
If you want to give it a try advancing again. There we go.
It's working?
Yep, that's working now.
Okay, great. Oh, I'm so sorry for that, everyone. So here are some of the slides that were missed. So I'll just quickly go over some of these again. So here, this is the logo that was first developed in the States, Florida, back in 2009. As you can see, it's just organisms. It's a mix of aquatic and terrestrials. These were the logos that were used in Canada. So the one on the left here was the BC Don't Let It Loose logo. Again, a mix of terrestrials and aquatics. And then the Alberta one here on the right. So as I mentioned, essentially the gap that we're trying to address here is that we didn't want to confuse the public into thinking that they weren't allowed to possess the animals, whereas the real message we wanted to get across was just to not release them. So in 2019, NAISC identified the need to standardize the Don't Let It Loose brand across Canada and to focus it on aquatic invasive species. We also wanted to expand it to address additional release pathways beyond only pets. So the vision essentially was to prevent the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species using a nationally recognizable brand. We also wanted consistent messaging that aligned with existing legislation. All of this would be for the purpose of increasing public awareness of the potential harm caused by the introduction of any organism into any body of water in Canada. NAISC also wanted to acknowledge and build off the successes of existing Don't Let It Loose messaging by retaining the tagline. To get all of this started, what we did was Fisheries and Oceans Canada funded an external contract for a graphic designer to develop new logos for Don't Let It Loose and to develop a brand toolkit that outlines how the brand is to be delivered consistently across Canada. So even though just to review what our desired outcomes were, even though we originally wanted to retain the tagline, part of the contractor's process was to consider if this existing tagline for Don't Let It Loose would be effective for reaching our goals, or if we should take a more positive approach with our language. There's a lot of don'ts and sort of what can be perceived as negative wording here. So our desired outcome was to encourage the public compliance with regulations and legislation that prohibit people from releasing species that are not native into the wild. Public awareness of AIS is perceived as being relatively low. And what that means is that externally driven motivation like rules and fines would be more effective than targeting people's intrinsic value of the environment. So as such, it was decided to retain negative terms like stop and don't in the taglines as a form of command and control messaging that encourages people to change their behavior to avoid negative consequences. So the new Don't Let It Loose is designed as a system of brand elements to reach key public audiences in Canada that fall within 4 distinct pathways of AIS introduction. And I'm going to go over each of those 4 in the next slides here. So our first pathway was pets and plants from aquariums, ponds, and water gardens. As I'm sure many of you know, some of the world's worst AIS have been linked to aquarium and water garden release, such as lionfish, goldfish, flowering rush. And so we wanted to make sure Don't Let It Loose targeted this pathway still. Second pathway was live food. So the release of live food can also be referred to as cultural, mercy, merit, compassion, religious, or life release. Liu and colleagues noted that people who release organisms for cultural or moral purposes are likely not aware of the harm caused by their actions, especially in the cases where the species being released are invasive or have the potential to be invasive. Third pathway is live bait. So Drake and colleagues found that most people release bait fish because it's convenient, or they incorrectly believe that releasing bait is beneficial for an ecosystem. An example of this is that an angler may believe that they are providing food for other fish by dumping their leftover bait after a fishing trip. And the fourth and final pathway is sports and recreational fishing. Some anglers release sport fish into new habitats in hopes of creating better conditions for fishing. But as we know, this often leads to the introduction of top-level predators that become invasive. And a lot of these releases are legal. So we're sort of at the halfway point here. So we've gone through the background. We've covered why the tagline works. We looked at some of the messaging gaps from previous Don't Let It Loose versions, and I've explained NAISC's vision of needing a more consistent visual brand that targets different pathways of AIS and addresses the actual act of releasing. So now let's actually take a look at the cool stuff. Let's look at what the new material, the material itself. So the new Don't Let It Loose brand essence is communicated through 4 central brand messages. The first one is a compelling fact about the harm caused by AIS to engage the audience. Here we use releasing any organism into any body of water can start an invasion, but you can stop it. The second message is the regulatory statement that explains what actions are prohibited. It is illegal everywhere in Canada to introduce any organism into a body of water. Next, we use a clear call to action and tagline to tell the audience what to do. Stop aquatic invasive species, don't let it loose. And finally, we encourage the audience to take action and contact us for more information on how they can protect our waters. So here are the different logo components. We've developed multiple new logos from the same brand template. The logos have numerous components that all contribute to getting the message across clearly to audiences. Some of the components here remain constant across all of the logos, while others can be adapted for particular audiences or for the pathway that you're trying to target. So first, all logos have a universal prohibition symbol that signals to the audience that the action in question is illegal. This is the classic red circle with the line going through it. Next, all logos demonstrate the act of dumping a bucket to clearly symbolize that the act of release of the focal species is illegal. The water being dumped from the bucket includes several species and symbolizes the possibility of unknowingly releasing other organisms. The main focal species here that you see a D is specific to the pathway being targeted. And this is in red because this component can be changed out depending on, like I said, your audience, your pathway, your species of interest. And finally, the call to action and tagline are always included to provide context to the rest of the logo. We've also created a few color options for the logos to ensure that we have visible, high contrast images on all materials that we create. So here you can see that we've created a logo for each pathway, depicting the variants and focal species for the logos. And I just want to mention that there's really nothing stopping NAISC from creating more of these in the future. These are the focal species I was talking about. So here you have European green crab, for example. And this is just to show that all materials are available in both official languages. So on to the brand toolkit. The brand toolkit is essentially the Bible for Don't Let It Loose. It's an in-depth guide for providing nationally consistent implementation of Don't Let It Loose across Canada. So it's essentially a bunch of standards. It includes standards for fonts, for colors, standards for layouts and language, among many other small but very important details. The brand toolkit also includes suggested layouts for print materials. So here I have an example of a poster, a trifold brochure, PowerPoint template, pop-up banners, adhesive stickers. And so these templates can be used and the messaging can be tweaked depending on the jurisdiction. And again, what pathway, what species is being targeted here. Finally, we also worked with our provincial and territorial partners to develop consistent language for our individual websites. This language is based heavily on existing Don't Let It Loose websites and on scientific literature. And we encourage others to use it as well so that the public encounters the same information everywhere. It's really important that the messaging is consistent. So moving forward, next steps. In order to implement the new Don't Let It Loose materials across Canada, we'll be disseminating information through our provincial and territorial partners. Anyone interested in using these materials should contact us for their closest provincial territorial government AIS programs for more information, or if you would like to develop partnership plans. Given the flexibility of the new logo with a focal species, the material can also be adapted to other species. For example, you can use it to focus on terrestrials if you wanted, or a mix of aquatic and terrestrial species on a single logo. And the brand toolkit, of course, can be expanded over time once lessons are learned from implementation. If we develop new templates or if we find that certain messaging works better than others, then we can always go back and adjust this brand toolkit. Nothing is written in stone. Of course, we're not just working off of hunches here. Here are all the references referred to in this presentation if you'd like more information. And finally, here is the contact information for myself and others in our team. Again, if anyone's interested in using the materials and to develop partnership plans or to obtain more information, you should contact your provincial and territorial government AIS programs if you're in Canada. Otherwise, you can feel free to contact us directly. So with that, thank you all very much for listening and don't let it loose. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Tim. That was great. I don't see any questions coming in yet. Just one comment saying that the brand toolkit was really cool. Another one saying great presentation. So just a couple of good comments there.
Glad to hear. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next presenter. Thanks again, Tim. That was great.
Thank you very much.
Just one second here. So our next presenter is Cecilia Weibert. Cecilia is a senior program specialist for the Great Lakes Commission Aquatic Invasive Species Program. In this role, she supports the regional coordination efforts of the Great Lakes Panel on Aquatic Nuisance Species and the Invasive Mussel Collaborative. She also provides support for a variety of invasive species projects. She holds a master's degree in coastal zone management, as well as a bachelor's degree in marine affairs and policy from the University of Miami in Florida. This presentation will review the process for developing a binational regional analysis of recreational boating, aquatic invasive species prevention programs in the Great Lakes. These prevention programs include regulatory policies, non-regulatory management activities, and outreach programs. The results of this analysis will also be shared in an interactive dashboard. So Cecilia, just give me a second here to give you control and I'll let you share your screen.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me see this one, I think. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes, it looks great.
Awesome. All right. So thank you all for joining me today to hear a little bit about our binational work on tracking progress on recreational boating pathway prevention. As was mentioned in the introduction, this is an effort that's been conducted through the regional initiative Blue Accounting. So a brief background on Blue Accounting. It was initiated in 2013 through the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence governors and premiers as a strategic approach and supporting information system to measure progress towards our collective desired outcomes for the Great Lakes. There are several issues of focus for Blue Accounting, including AIS. Management of the aquatic invasive species issue is led by us at the Great Lakes Commission with support from the Nature Conservancy. Our work is guided by Blue Accounting AIS work group, and that group draws its membership from federal, state, and provincial natural resource agencies and nonprofits. We'd like to include tribal representation as we evolve to our next phase of Blue Accounting over the next few months. And one of the roles for Blue Accounting for AIS is to identify goals and strategy for management of invasive species. And so today, as mentioned in the title slide and introduction, I'm going to focus on our recreational boating work. And I just want to note ahead of time, this work focuses on boating, not angling or other recreational activities. So recreational boating, what does that mean? For Blue Accounting, we want to track progress towards effective, oh, I'm going through lots of slides real quick here. We want to track progress towards effective regional management of the recreational activities pathway. And that includes both the implementation of education and outreach programs that encourage voluntary behavior change, as well as the adoption of comprehensive and regionally harmonized watercraft inspection and decontamination programs. In order to track progress, we first need to understand our management priorities for this pathway within the Great Lakes region and our baseline of operations. Previous work on establishing regional priorities for this pathway has centered primarily on the Western United States and the National Sea Grant Law Center and Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies model regulation for state watercraft and inspection and decontamination programs. Early on, our work group decided that the Western States model wasn't really applicable to the Great Lakes region. That model was largely driven by the spread of invasive mussels, a species that's been present in the Great Lakes for decades. And the scale and scope of pathway access is much smaller in Western states compared to the Great Lakes region. So where did that leave us? Rather than identifying a model or standard to define progress, we decided to take an approach that would assess states and provinces in terms of their consistency in recreational boating prevention. Starting from this perspective was key. Our tone throughout our development was not one of judging or grading, but really focusing on a collaborative effort to identify what programs are at work in the Great Lakes region and how they contribute to the prevention of AIS introduction and spread via recreational boating. So to begin with, we distributed a data request about AIS programs and management to our work group members. This data request was intentionally vague and wide-ranging. We basically just wanted to see what kind of information we would get back from folks, as that sort of gave us already an insight into what their priorities were and have a better understanding of what kind of data and information that we would have access to for each jurisdiction. This data request was only sent to state and provincial work group members. It does not include federal or tribal efforts at this point. So as we move through discussion of the development and our outcomes, bear in mind that this only reflects state and provincial programs at this point. So while the Great Lakes Commission staff worked on this data request to understand the sort of non-regulatory side of things, the Nature Conservancy was already underway with a regulatory analysis, and this was based on the concepts presented in that Western States regulatory model. So we really had a side-by-side parallel approach where we were working on our non-regulatory management and outreach components at the same time as our regulatory analysis. So we were keeping both aspects of management in mind as we were moving forward through our development process. So following the return of those data requests and sort of combing through the information that we got, we scheduled a series of interviews with our state and provincial work group members to follow up on what we learned and to really just have these general informal conversations about the structure of each jurisdiction's program and what activities they operated through that program. We ended each interview by asking, what are the one or two things that you would implement tomorrow if you had unlimited resources and regulatory authority? And those interview notes were collated and coded to understand the common themes of prevention between activities that are ongoing around the basin and these sort of wish list activities. And so by matching those up and drawing in that regulatory component from the Nature Conservancy, we were able to arrive at a comprehensive list of what a holistic, robust prevention program for recreational boating looks like in the Great Lakes region. That is the scope of what's reasonable and ongoing based on what we heard and what regulations are currently on the books. And so we arrived at a total of 33 different program components that may be implemented for prevention purposes. And then our final step was internally, we filled out jurisdictional information for each of those 33 components, recording was that component met or ongoing within that jurisdiction? If yes, what does it look like? If no, why not? What barriers exist to doing so? And that information was also reviewed by our work group members and used as the basis for building our interactive dashboard. So before we get to the fun dashboard stuff, quick review. As I mentioned, we had 33 different components. Those components are categorized here into 5 different prevention program categories. We made the decision to, for each of these categories, encompass both legislative and non-regulatory components. This holistic view of management was important to our work group. And so we didn't want any of these categories to be taken out of context with the relevant legislative provisions or those non-regulatory management actions that support those provisions. So here we have agency capacity. This basically asks, are you able to support your program with sufficient funding, personnel, authority, and ability to implement and manage recreational boating prevention programs? Partnerships, are you able to coordinate with external partners to implement and partner with your prevention programs? Outreach, are you able to implement outreach campaigns, and are those campaigns designed to educate boaters and encourage responsible behaviors in a consistent manner? Reporting and evaluation, does the relevant management agency regularly report on and evaluate their program? And then finally, inspection and decontamination. Are you able to implement broad-scale watercraft inspection and decontamination programs? And so within each of these categories, I've listed here the number of components within each. There's some inherent weighting of these categories just based on the number of components within each of them. but we ran this by our work group and everyone was comfortable with this spread here. So I mentioned that for each of these categories and each of these components, we filled in that sort of, do you have this component, do you not, why or why not information. So that all lives in this very overwhelming spreadsheet. This is actually an example of Ontario's program. So I don't know if you're able to see the font here, but basically it just lays out, within this program category of agency capacity, here are the 8 different program components, and here's how it is or is not implemented within Ontario. And so what that supports, as I mentioned, this interactive dashboard, and forgive me, it's on my second screen, so I'm going to be looking over here for a bit. We have this mapping dashboard that was built in ArcGIS Online. It's available right now on our Blue Accounting website, blueaccounting.org. And it's really neat. It's color-coded depending on those 33 prevention program components. So for each of these jurisdictions, how many of those components are integrated sort of across the board. And if you click on a jurisdiction, we'll click on Ontario here, a little box will pop up here that says not just the total number of prevention program components that are implemented, in this case 23 of 33, it also breaks down across each of those different categories. So, within agent capacity, there are 6 of 8, partnerships 3 of 4, so on and so forth. Down here at the bottom of our screen, as I mentioned earlier, we have this really broad scope of a pathway and access to that pathway. So we have a list of the number of public boat launches in the Great Lakes region and the number of motorized boats that are registered under 26 feet in length. These numbers automatically populate for the entire Great Lakes region to give you a full overview scope of that. But if you select a jurisdiction here, we'll click on Ontario and zoom out quite a bit. These numbers will automatically update for the province. So in the province of Ontario, there's 3,371 public boat launches and over 1 million registered boaters. And as I mentioned, that spreadsheet, it's available and linked here right above our dashboard. Anyone can go in and download that and see the supporting information that informs this dashboard. As I mentioned, we're going through a sort of re-envisioning, redevelopment process for Blue Accounting over the next couple of months. So we're hoping that by summer, we'll be able to relaunch our website and be able to provide this information in a more accessible format. So while the spreadsheet has to be downloaded right now to get this information, in the future, we anticipate being able to provide more information up front, specifically for Ontario or any other jurisdiction, beyond just clicking on that pop-up box to see the exact number of components. Really build this out into something that's interactive so you can go even further into the data and it's all just built in to one unit. So going back to our slides now, we'll move on to just some quick lessons learned. By aggregating information across each of our jurisdictions' programs, not only are we recording those successes and roadblocks, but we're also setting up a base for coordination between jurisdictions on those successes and roadblocks. So sort of allowing users, managers, and regulators in each of those jurisdictions to identify, what are some low-hanging fruit for components that haven't been implemented, what models are currently in place in other jurisdictions that could be adopted, and really trying to facilitate that flow of communication and information. As I stated before, one size does not fit all. Our model for Western states was generally agreed upon not to be a reasonable standard to hold Great Lakes states and provinces to. So we had to go ahead and just sort of develop our own process. And so rather than creating that Great Lakes standard, we wanted to emphasize consistency between jurisdictions. And finally, that holistic point of view is key to capturing the full scope of prevention and recognizing that these prevention programs can be strong even in the absence of extensive legislative provision. So for those jurisdictions that might not have extensive regulations on the books right now, that doesn't mean that they're inherently worse at regulating or doing a worse job at preventing spread through that pathway. It just means that they have to take a different approach. So that's it for me. I'll take any questions if we have any.
Thanks, Cecilia. That was great. I'll watch the question box here. I don't see any yet, but we'll give people a few minutes here.
Maddie, I think there was a question for Tim if you want to ask that one now while we're waiting. Oh, I think he answered it. Never mind.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat box there for Tim's answer. So I don't see any more questions coming in yet. I guess we could keep moving along, and then if anyone has any, Cecilia can hopefully answer them later. Thanks again, Cecilia. And next up we have Sunci Avlijas. Just give me 1 second here to share my screen. And hopefully you can see that. Okay, so Sunci is a PhD candidate in the Recreational lab at McGill University. Her current work is focused on improving the ability to predict where invasive fishes will have a high impact and where they are less likely to create a disturbance. Sunci primarily works with Eurasian tench as a model because it's a successful invader at a global scale, yet at a more local scale, it has failed to establish in many watersheds where it was purposely stocked. She complements her field research with lab experiments that examine how impacts of invaders change across different environments. The tench is spreading through the St. Lawrence River and poses an imminent invasion threat to the Great Lakes. This presentation will explore factors that are likely to affect tench establishment and impacts. I will give you the controls here, Sunci.
Okay.
That looks great.
It does. It's showing the presentation screen, not
Yep,
the.
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. I guess it doesn't show me what it's showing you guys.
Yeah.
So, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And so today I want to give you a pretty broad overview of an impending invader to the Great Lakes that has a really long and global invasion history, but that manages to continue to surprise us. Like when it showed up in Bay of Quinte in 2018. So of course I'm talking about the tench. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of encountering it yet, here's a photo of a relatively large individual that we captured when we were sampling in Washington State. So tench feed on invertebrates. They mostly hang out in benthic areas of wetlands. They seem to like slow flowing waters, and the juveniles are pretty distinct, I think, from our native minnows, although tench adults are immediately recognizable, especially because they grow rather large. Also, they're not quite as large as common carp. They're easy to recognize, but I think that the juveniles are still quite a bit deeper bodied and have those small scales, and I think if any of you had encountered them, you'd recognize them pretty quickly. So that's just to introduce you to the species. But I want to talk to you mostly about its invasion history. So as I mentioned, tench have had this long history of introductions. They are native to Eurasia, so that's all the areas you see in yellow on the map. And because they're really good at surviving transport, because they can tolerate really low oxygen conditions, they have actually been moved around for at least the last 500 years. So even their native range is not super clearly resolved. And it was fairly recently that it was established through genetic analyses that they're probably actually introduced to Spain and Portugal, because they were probably brought over from Germany in the 1500s. So of course, thanks to that same superpower that the tench have to survive long trips in pretty poor oxygen conditions, they were one of the candidate species for introductions to new continents when we started moving fish a little bit all over the globe at the end of the 1800s. So they were introduced to Australia, South Africa, broadly across the United States, and now they have established populations on every continent except for Antarctica. The introduction that we're concerned about, though, in the Great Lakes is a lot more recent than those introductions in the 1800s. Tench arrived in Quebec in the late 80s. They were brought in by a farmer that decided to acquire about 30 small tench from an aquaculture facility in Germany, and he brought them over on a commercial flight in a picnic cooler and then dumped them on his property in his ponds in a town very close to the Richelieu River. Unfortunately, from there, the tench escaped as the farmer decided he didn't want them anymore, and so he drained the ponds. And then there was also a flooding event that unfortunately coincided with that draining, and tench were able to swim through the agricultural runoff and get into the Richelieu River. So although the first years after the introduction, the population remained relatively close to the initial site where it was introduced, since 2015, it has been spreading relatively rapidly, and it has colonized the entirety of Lake Champlain and has been spreading both upstream and downstream in the St. Lawrence River. And at some sites where there is a lot of favorable habitat for tench reproduction, and a lot of wetlands, a lot of shallow, nice wetlandy, slow flow habitat, like in Lac Saint-Pierre, tench population has undergone an exponential increase in abundance. And of course, we're finding them ever closer to Lake Ontario. There have been increasing captures on the Ontario side of the St. Lawrence River around the Cornwall area over the past few years. And of course, we have that notorious detection from 2018 in Bay of Quinte, which is kind of setting off the warning signals for the Great Lakes. So as I mentioned, this is not the first time that tench has been introduced to North America. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to do is to look at how those previous introductions went, because it can give us an idea of maybe some hints about how it will go this time. Tench was stocked extensively between 1885 and 1895. And on this map, all of those dots represent stocking events from that effort, except for of course, the little dots around Lake Champlain area. That's the current Richelieu expansion. And then the California introduction was also due to a rogue farmer introducing them independently. But as you can see, a large majority of the attempted stocking events from the 1800s failed. So every yellow diamond represents a failure of stocking. And looking at that pattern, we could have been forgiven for thinking that tench is actually a really poor invader that's perhaps unlikely to establish and is not something that we should worry too much about. Except that at some of those sites where it was introduced, it did really, really well. Those are photos of our nets from our sampling in Washington State, and we were just pulling up tons and tons of tench. At every site that we sampled, we found tench, and at some of the sites, both lakes and sites in the Pend Oreille River, tench were comprised the majority of the biomass. that we collected. By comparison, using the same gear and the same sampling effort, we sampled sites around Lake Champlain and the St. Lawrence River and the Richelieu, and we had many more sites where tench were below our detection threshold, but that is very likely to be due to the fact that we're really early in the invasion still, and we did the sampling in 2015, 2016 in the St. Lawrence River, and I wouldn't be surprised if even if we repeated the sampling today, those numbers in the St. Lawrence River would be much higher. Of course, there can also be differences between areas that are due to other things, such as differences in habitat, differences in environmental variables, differences in the biotic community that exerts biotic resistance to the growth of the population. And so I'm looking a little bit more closely into that from this data. But what's really important is that they are able to establish we know that they're able to establish and grow and spread throughout the St. Lawrence, and they're very likely to do so in the Great Lakes as well. In terms of establishments, going back to that historical stocking of tench in the US, I really think that this kind of historical data presents us with some really great opportunities to look at what can help, what drives that establishment success or failure, so that we can help predict it in areas such as the Great Lakes. One of the great advantages of this is that there has been such a long time span since the time when we know they were introduced. So we can be fairly confident that those sites were considering tench to be absent are actual absences. And that's in contrast to when we do field surveys, short-term field surveys in the present, where we're not quite sure if they're just below our detection limit. Well, 100 years have gone by. They've never showed up in any surveys or angler catches or commercial catches. So we can be pretty sure that the tench failed at those sites. The other thing about this historic stocking is that the spatial span is quite large. And so it's really interesting to be able to look at kind of the patterns of like, why did they establish in those areas compared to others. So one of our first guesses for this was that establishment success might just be driven by propagill pressure. So in some of those states where tench established, they were just more tench that had been introduced. The stocking program was not distributed equally across the states. But when we looked at it, we found that that was surprisingly not the case. So the darker the color red, the more tench were introduced to that state, and many states where there were lots of tench sent, like tens of thousands of tench, the establishment was not successful, whereas in other areas where there were much lower, where there was much lower propagill pressure, they did succeed. So what we're doing now is looking at whether, I'm working on this with my colleague from the lab, Chris Benjamin, and we're looking at what are some other factors, some climate variables and biotic community information can help us explain these patterns a little bit better. But when we went to the literature to look at what might be affecting tench establishment success and abundance, what the literature does tell us is that areas that are likely to be hospitable are slow-flowing, heavily vegetated areas, and that's partly because tench really need vegetation to reproduce. Their eggs stick to the vegetation. The juveniles use the macrophyte beds as refuge. And they really don't seem to care that much about the temperature, at least in terms of survival. As I mentioned, I think 3 times already, they can survive low oxygen conditions. And so, yes, so at least what we can tell from the literature is that it's really about presence of wetlands, but hopefully the larger scale analysis will give us some better ideas about whether some climate variables do play a role, because that's helpful in actually making predictions, because there are certainly wetlands in some of those areas where Tench failed. So secondarily, the other thing that we're really interested in is Tench impacts. I think it's fairly fair to say that Tench can reach Lake Ontario. I think it's pretty likely that they are going to be able to establish there if they're able to establish in the St. Lawrence. So one of the things that really interests us is how what impacts Tench might have, and how these impacts might change across different habitats. So again, we went to the literature, and one of the impacts that was listed or that had been reported previously was that Tench can exert competitive interactions with benthic fishes. Additionally, when they have really high predation pressures on periphyton grazers such as snails, they can lead to cascading effects on, for example, macrophyte abundance, because the periphyton ends up shading them out. They're also occasionally reported to consume fish eggs. They also bioturbate while feeding on soft substrate, although to a lesser extent than carp or goldfish. And they do carry pathogens. But the potential impact that we really focused on was those potential competitive interactions with other benthic fishes. So one of the things we did was an assessment of the diet of Tench in the 3 waters of body that are close to home and that are close to Lake Ontario, so the Richelieu River, Lake Champlain, and the St. Lawrence. And one of the interesting things that's come out of that is that the diet composition does vary quite a bit between the 3 water bodies. And although they're invertebrates, they can shift their diet from one group to the other. And so that might actually affect who they compete with at different sites. So which, whereas they might cause an issue for a species in one place, but not in another place if they're switching their diet so that it overlaps or doesn't overlap with that species. So we were also, as I mentioned, interested in looking at how their impacts through their predation effects might change in different habitats. And so we were interested in looking at how this might change on different sediments. So Tench are always thought of as a fish that's found on soft substrates. Almost every fact sheet you look up about Tench will say that they're in vegetated, slow flow moving areas with soft substrates. And this is partly because they do burrow in the sediment when they estivate or during winter when the dissolved oxygen gets really low. They also do need the macrophytes, as I explained, but we were really interested in whether they can feed just as efficiently on coarse substrate as sand substrate. We expected them to have, if they're, to be a lot more efficient and to grow much better on soft substrates, because presumably they've evolved to be better at living in that kind of habitat. But when we ran some mesocosm experiments where we followed the growth of Tench in basins that had either rocks or sand or no substrate, we didn't find a difference in their growth at all, which was surprising to us. So we wanted to look at it a little bit more closely in the lab to really measure their consumption rates by using functional response experiments. And so we ran these experiments on rocks and sand, again, with individual Tench, each time being offered different densities of snails. And at the end of 3 hours, we would just count out how many were consumed and how many were left. And that allowed us to build these functional response curves, which is really just prey consumed versus the prey density offered. And what was interesting here is that, once again, we didn't see any difference in the maximum feeding rates on sand versus on rocks at either temperature, but there was a big difference in the shape of the curve at 18 degrees compared to 26 degrees. What's important here is that Tench at 18 degrees, when there were only a few snails offered, did not, you know, they were not always successful at finding them and consuming them, whereas, which is why you get that S shape with that lower slope at the beginning. Whereas at 26 degrees, when we increase the temperature, the functional response curve switched to what we call a type 2 curve, because even when we provided only 2 or 4 snails, the Tench seek them out and manage to find them and capture them and consume them. And so this kind of curve is concerning because it can have a destabilizing effect on the prey population. And it suggests that with warmer temperatures, Tench can actually have a more significant impact in that they can completely deplete prey species, at least locally, which not only impacts that specific prey species, but also can lead to larger competitive interactions with native fishes that they're competing with for prey. So the overarching take-home message for me from the lessons that Tench is teaching us are similar to that of most invaders, and that is that it's really important to assess the individual introduction and think about the individual invaders' characteristics and a habitat or the geographic region where they're being introduced. Although we might have, you know, found good large patterns in terms of, for example, propagule pressure is related to establishment success in general, but for some species that may not be good enough to protect us from them establishing. So generally, we can't rely on small propagule size to limit establishment success of Tench, which is very important, which means that it's very important to control the spread, the humanated spread of this species, because even a small number of individuals carried to a new water body by, you know, a single human can lead to the establishment of a new spreading population of this fish. Secondly, the main superpower of Tench is its tolerance to dissolved oxygen conditions, which is important to consider when we think about management strategies for this fish in terms of identifying the vectors that it might use to travel to a new area. Whereas the low dissolved oxygen conditions might pose a barrier to other fish species, they're less likely to stop the Tench from spreading. Third, although Tench can be found in highest abundance in soft substrates in those wetland areas, partly because that's where they have greater reproductive success, so they reach higher abundances, and that's where we find the juveniles. It doesn't mean that they cannot feed and even grow on coarse habitats, and this has implications, especially for spread of Tench. There was a length of time before we did the survey of Lake Champlain and found Tench all throughout the southern side, where it was hypothesized that Tench wouldn't really move outside of that northern part of Lake Champlain that's very wetlandy, because the middle part of Lake Champlain is deeper and has rockier habitat, and so it was thought that they wouldn't, you know, they weren't likely to get across and swim across this kind of habitat barrier to their spread. But actually, we're finding that Tench can travel large distances. There's a really cool telemetry study that DFO Quebec is doing currently, where they're looking at exactly how much individual Tench might travel. And I think that what's coming out of that is that they can travel quite a bit, as we saw with that Tench that jumped to Bay of Quinte. And so it's important to not consider, if there are really long stretches of suboptimal habitat, it's really important to not consider them as barriers to spread. They are also flexible in terms of their diets. Even though they're invertebrates, they can switch which group of inverts they feed on, and so who they compete with might change between water bodies. And last, it's important to consider that environmental variables are likely to actually affect the per capita impacts, the per capita effects of these invaders, as we saw with temperature in our experiments. And so to consider how, if those variables are going to be changing through time, our risk assessment may also need to change, and consider changes in temperature warming, for example, like climate warming, in the risk assessment for the species, because the impact it's projected to have now may not be the same as in the future. So if you're interested in Tench, you can find a lot of the literature synthesis and history of the Tench introduction in Quebec that I just presented today in a paper that we put out a couple of years ago in CGFAS. And I hope to have some more publications with the results I hinted at very soon. And I would just like to recognize and acknowledge that I had so much help from so many people and support from different organizations in the work that I did for this research that was for my PhD. And thank you so much for your listening, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Sunci. That was great. I'm excited to look at that publication you mentioned. So we do have a couple questions coming in here. I'll just read them out to you. So the first one was asking if the tench is a tropical or a temperate fish.
It's a temperate fish, so it's from Europe. The stock that was brought to the Richelieu and the stock that was brought on that big US stocking was from Germany.
Okay, thank you. The next one is asking about how long it takes to reach maturity and what the fecundity rate is of the fish.
So there's variation in when it reaches maturity. I have seen reports anywhere from 2 to 6 years. I think a lot of it depends on how much effort they're putting into growth. When they are in a predator-free space, like a pond that doesn't have predators, they seem to grow a lot less quickly, and so I guess they can reach maturity earlier. While conversely, sometimes they put a lot of effort into growing really big, and so then maturity presumably takes longer. Fecundity, I forget the exact figure, I'm so sorry, but they can reproduce up to three times a year. It depends on the temperature. They start reproducing at 18 degrees. And then it just depends how much time there is throughout the summer. But each time they can lay like at least tens of thousands of eggs, if not more. I'm sorry, that number just escapes me right now.
Oh, that's
in the paper.
Thank you.
Did I answer everything? Sorry.
Yeah, I think I answered that question. Okay. Good. There's a couple more here. Let's see if we can work through all of them. So the next one, is there a preference for which plants they lay their eggs on? And do you know how they interact with invasive plants?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's super interesting. And there are a few, there have been a few papers that are a bunch older from Europe that mention that, oh, they really like laying their eggs on Myriophyllum or on Elodia, but they're very anecdotal, and they weren't the result of some kind of test or comparison. So I am not, I'm a little reluctant to take them at face value, but yeah, I don't think that that's something that anyone's really looked at in terms of a preference for a certain plant. And again, in terms of their interactions with invasive plants, that is super interesting. I think that would be really worth exploring.
Thank you. So the next one here, when removal of tench are conducted, such as at a pond where it was found, what methods do you use for removal and destruction?
So I know what has been done before is that the entire pond was drained down and then root-known. There was an example of that being done in Ontario. There was a pond near Orangeville where they had detected tench. Somebody had stocked them in there, and they drained down the pond and root-known it. When it's a small pond and all of the water can be removed, that probably can be relatively successful. One of the problems is that tench do burrow into the substrate, and so they can avoid some of those negative effects of rotenone. And I know in Washington State, they have rotenone entire small lakes that they manage where they stock bass and trout and stuff. And then tench got in there and they were really disrupting the sports fishery. So they've rotenone entire lakes, and it seems like there's about like an 8 or 9 year cycle after which the population just bounces back because they don't manage to kill all of them, because I guess they can't drain, or they don't drain the entire lake. So it, depending on the size of the body of water, it can be more or less successful.
Thank you. So I think we still have time for a few more. There's, I think, 3 more questions here. Do diet shifts or different prey species influence growth or condition?
I presume they would, but I don't know. Yeah, that's not something that I looked at, and it's, I haven't seen anything about, yeah, actual natural prey affecting the growth. Tench are a big species in some countries in Eastern Europe in aquaculture. And so there are some articles where they compared like commercial feed and a mix of commercial feed and, I don't know, bloodworms, and they found that there was something that was more optimal for their growth. So obviously there is some relationship, but I don't know in terms of in the field with natural prey and the prey switching, how that works. Nobody's looked at that.
Great, thank you. So another one about what they eat. So you mentioned that they eat a lot of invertebrates. What role would they play in spreading some invasive invertebrates, like cladoceran resting eggs that may survive?
Oh, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know at all, but I presume that that could happen. Yeah, I don't, that's completely outside of anything I've looked at, but that's a full thought. Well, not a good thought, I guess. It's not good if they do that, but yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to
That'd
look
be interesting
into.
to look at, yeah, for sure.
So then, is there a market for human consumption of tench?
Well, based on the experiments in the late 1800s, no, not at all. So they did bring tench in as a food fish. That was why they were bringing a lot of those fish in. That's why they brought in common carp at first. And even at the time, there was very little interest in tench in North America. There was a bit of enthusiasm for carp, which then died down. And it's just not a fish that is really widely consumed. There are some places in Europe where it's consumed. Some places, I mentioned the aquaculture, but there's some places where it's native, where it's fished, and like the wild caught tench are popular in northern Italy. But I don't know that there would be a big market for it in North America.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one last question. It's just asking if you could add a little bit more about the life cycle of the tench. Just explain that a little bit more.
So they, so they lay the eggs in the vegetation, and then when the juveniles hatch, they grow relatively fast. And I think that they just hang out in the vegetation, and they're quite quick at escaping predators. It was a whole effort and a half to try to catch enough small tench for our experiments, because we did like a collaboration between 3 teams to even catch like the 15 that we caught for our experiments. So they're quite good at escaping predation, and I think they grow relatively quickly in order to escape the gape size. And then within 2 to 6 years, they start to reproduce. Yeah, at 18 degrees, they start being able to develop eggs, and they can reproduce between like 2 or 3 times during a season. They live up to 20 or 30 years. 30 was like some extreme record that I found in the literature, but I think they do live for a couple decades. And they mostly hang out in the same wetland where they were born, I guess, until things get crowded and they start spreading out in search of new territories. But otherwise, if there is sufficient food and space, they don't, like, they're not a migratory fish. They kind of hang out where they are and they move around and search for food. I hope that covers it. I was trying to think of
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think that's all the questions. We were able to get through a lot of them. So thank you very much for your presentation today, and we'll switch over to the last one of the session. So just
Should I
share my
stop sharing?
screen. Yeah, I think I'll just should be able to take control back here. Thank you. Okay, so next we have David Young. So David Young is an avid fisherman and outdoorsman who spends much of his time on the land and within his traditional territory of Garden River First Nation. He's currently working for Natural Resources Canada while he finishes his Master of Science degree, where he's researching lake sturgeon movements using traditional knowledge and Western science in his home territory of Garden River. And his presentation today will cover some of the research he's doing, collaborating with the Western science and the traditional ecological knowledge, and some of the strengths and benefits of doing so, and the implications for invasive species management. So David, I will pass control over to you and let you take it away.
Sure, that sounds good. Whoa. Just showed everybody my whole presentation. Are you guys seeing the notes or the?
Yeah, we are seeing the notes version right now.
Okay, that's good.
There should be an option to choose which screen if you have two screens up.
I think you can go to display settings on, there you go.
There you go, looks good now.
Perfect. Yeah, I knew it was somewhere there. We'd practice it, but of course I forgot on the moment. So as Maddie indicated, my name is David Young. I'm a Master of Science candidate at Trent University, and today I'll be talking a little bit about my research with Garden River First Nation and the Anishinaabeg, Ontario Fisheries Resource Center. Sorry, is my webcam on?
No, it's not on yet.
No, sorry, I'll share that. Just there, am I visible now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, terrific. Sorry, as I was saying, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about my research with Garden River First Nation and the Anishinaabeg, Ontario Fisheries Resource Center, where I research lake sturgeon and Garden River First Nation, as well as in the St. Mary's River, just outside Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Before I get started, I'd just like to say thank you for having me today, and I hope everyone enjoys my presentation, and of course, I look forward to answering any questions afterwards. Okay. There we go. So again, just a little bit about myself. As Maddie mentioned, I'm a band member of Garden River First Nation. I spend a lot of time on my traditional territory, particularly fishing and hunting. And really getting to do this research has been a privilege in that sense, as it's allowed me to kind of spend more of my time on my traditional territory. A little bit more about myself, as I received my honors Bachelor of Science from Trent University in 2016. Afterwards, I began a short-term contract with the Anishinaabeg, Ontario Fisheries Resource Center, or AOFRC for short. After this opportunity with them, I was exposed to the Garden River Project, or what I will refer to as the Garden River Project. And this eventually became my Master of Science, again, where I'm at Trent University. And again, as Maddie mentioned, I am currently working for Natural Resource Canada as a forest fire geospatial technician. In this work, we're basically doing research to look at wildfire evacuations of remote communities, particularly Indigenous communities. On top of this kind of, I guess, current experience and what I do now, I have previously worked for various divisions of government at both the provincial and federal level. I work for non-governmental organizations as well as Indigenous communities or groups such as the Anishinaabeg, Ontario Fisheries Resource Center. Again, it's a mouthful. So now I would just like to introduce this concept of two-eyed seeing, which I would say has been really critical to the success of my project. It's basically this overarching theoretical framework for collaborating Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. It was coined by a Mi'kmaq elder named Albert Marshall in 2004, and it's really just about utilizing the strengths of two different ways of knowing. Essentially, it's a tool to bring together two ways of knowing to use all of our understandings to leave the world in a better place and not compromise the future of our youth, which is following the 7 generations principle, which is basically acknowledging that decisions that we make today should leave a sustainable world 7 generations from now. And this is, as I mentioned, a framework that I've really incorporated into my research, and something that I'm very happy that I was able to do. And as you'll learn, it's been very beneficial to my research. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about lake sturgeon and the species of interest. Acipenser fulvescens is their Latin name, and they're sometimes referred to as rock sturgeon, although their most common name is lake sturgeon. They are an elongate, scaleless, cartilaginous fish, and they are primarily a bottom-feeding fish through the use of their barbels and their protruding mouth. As you can see, they kind of have these like 3 or 4 whisker-like things. Most of them have 4. Or almost all of them have 4. Again, there might have just been an injury to the one in the picture in the bottom left, but regardless, they use these 4 barbels or whiskers, I often call them, depending on the audience I'm presenting to. They use these to kind of find food in the sediment, and that's their primary method of feeding. They also have these 5 rows of bony plates, commonly referred to as scutes, on the dorsal side of its body, and as you can see in the picture in the upper right-hand side, they're much more apparent or distinct in juveniles, and as the individual gets older, they appear almost recessed, but it's just due to the overall growth of the individual. The largest recorded individual was just over 2.4 meters in length and was approximately 180 kilograms, while the oldest recorded individual was 154 years of age. This is certainly more common, or more rare in terms of both size and age, as more commonly individuals are caught in kind of the 4 to 5 foot length, 50 to 70 pound range, as well as kind of the 40 to 50 years of age range. Their life history is really characterized by, a very long life, a late age at maturity, which can range from, 12 to 25 years of age for males, and kind of the 14 to 35 age range for females, which is dependent on a number of things. And finally, they have this kind of very interesting protracted spawning behavior where, males can only spawn every kind of 2 to 7 years, whereas females might only spawn every 4 to 9 years. So kind of considering all these different things, it's pretty apparent that, lake sturgeon are certainly unique among North American freshwater fish, and they've certainly been a pleasure to research, certainly throughout the work I've done in my thesis. So now a little bit more about my research. To date, there was a population estimate of about 500 individuals for this population within the Great Lakes, I guess just east of Sault Ste. Marie. This population estimate would actually mean that this meta population of lake sturgeon is at the lower end of self-sustaining levels. And with that in mind, we kind of wanted to do this research project also because of, lake sturgeon and the cultural significance to First Nations communities. And to kind of address some of the questions we had about this population or update, outdated information, we chose a couple tools, one of them being acoustic telemetry. And basically what's happened with acoustic telemetry is that there was a small, after the capture of an adult individual, there was a small surgery followed by insertion of a tag. And we did this for 59 individuals across 3 years. After the harvest of one individual, the number 59 has now been reduced to 58. And that individual was harvested by a member of Garden River First Nation. Basically, the acoustic telemetry was done to look at movement patterns and habitat preferences, as well as determine the dynamics and timing of the spawning migration they partake in semi-regularly, I'll say. Additionally, there was a genetic assessment that was completed, and this was to address a couple questions, but most importantly, determine the amount of genetic differentiation from other Great Lakes lake sturgeon populations, as well as determine the amount of genetic relatedness within this current population. Additionally, I attempted to match adult lake sturgeon to offspring, but unsuccessfully. And I've also been trying to determine the effective breeding size of this population. In total, 80 adult lake sturgeon genetic samples were analyzed, in addition to 153 larval lake sturgeon. So now this is just a video, or I should say a visualization what my data would look like on a yearly basis. So as you can see, this is from 2017 May and carries on to 2018 in May, and this is just my study area just east of Sault Ste. Marie. As you can see, the black dots are actually receiver locations where we have receivers stationed to try and track tag fish as they move through the system. As you'll see in kind of, I guess, the middle upper right region, there are a couple receivers that are out of the water, and that's just because of the map. I don't have good enough resolution to show the Garden River on this scale of map. So I'll just play this to kind of demonstrate the sort of data that I'm working with. As you can see, many of these fish kind of stay within the St. Mary's system so far, and this is kind of over the course of the summer now, moving into the fall. Right at the beginning of the video, it was kind of important to notice it happens quick just because of kind of the year that I've compressed down into a minute. That there were actually a few individuals that moved into the Garden River to participate in, theoretically participate in spawning behavior. I don't want to say that they did for sure, as I'm kind of waiting to reveal those results with my thesis, so I'll kind of leave that. But as you can see, as I mentioned, this population seems to be fairly consistently within this section of the St. Mary's River, just outside Garden River First Nation. So now I'm just going to talk about the integration of two approaches that I've used here, which is bringing together, Western science with traditional knowledge. It's really important to note that even though it's kind of an integration of two approaches, it's kind of really the creation of a third approach, which just brings together these kind of two ways of knowing. So first, I'd like to point out how acoustic telemetry was complemented by traditional ecological knowledge and vice versa. Beyond the simplistics of having better site selection and better access points on a fairly not necessarily remote but difficult to access river, beyond I guess that sense, there was obviously the importance of traditional knowledge providing information on spawning behavior, both in terms of when lake sturgeon have been seen in the Garden River, where they've been seen, potential spawning locations, things of that nature. That's really helped us use acoustic telemetry to its full capabilities in terms of tracking them on a full year basis, especially for a migratory fish like lake sturgeon, who often participate in extensive migrations in the spring to participate in spawns. Additionally, the genetic assessment was, or I should say is, very complementary to what traditional knowledge has suggested. Throughout a couple different sessions, I should say, it was kind of brought forth that there was the presence of multiple spawning sites and potentially multiple spawning tributaries with multiple spawning runs. And fish geneticists, I'd say, would agree that you would expect that to have positive impacts on genetic relatedness, and thus far some preliminary results. Record the way that things have been in the face of, increasing number of invasive species, kind of coming into our habitats and coming into our environments and traditional territories. So with all this in mind, there are still some challenges that remain despite the, I would say the unrecognized but present combating of invasive species throughout, Indigenous nations across Canada. A perfect example of this would be sea lamprey.